Presentations. What almost all of you mentioned was impact. How do we show impact? How do we measure impact? I imagined it's not too easy to measure it always either, let alone show it and present the benefits to the stakeholders. What you also mentioned was move the discussion from the focus of data to openness. Would any one of you like to elaborate on how we do those two things together, how we aim those goals together? Richard, for example?
So I think those two things are linked. That you move the conversation on beyond the sort of data element towards the openness one by talking about impact. And on measurement of impact, I think it's a twofold thing. One is as we have good examples coming through, we should take the time to document them properly and to tell the world about them. It's one of the reasons that my slide deck was quite so heavy on those examples, because I felt like that's not something that we've been doing enough of. The other is on the macro side, then there are lots of reports by people like McKinsey, by Boston Consulting Group, by Deloitte, all putting an enormous figure on the impacts or the upside of open data. I think the latest figure from McKinsey was $3 trillion. Now, I have no idea how they came up with that number, but they're all consistently large. So it felt to me like the big gap is sort of giving showing those intermediary steps, because I haven't seen a sort of robust demolition of the sort of scarily large numbers. So demonstrating those sort of intermediary steps.
I would like to add that from my perspective, it's kind of too early in the game to really measure the impacts. I mean, nowadays, open data is becoming very popular. So yes, it's very clear that all kinds of players, governments, and other institutions ask for the impact. But if I like what you mentioned, like with the evolvement of the internet. I think we are in a very early stage. So all of those figures that look at, especially at the economic impact, for me are perhaps necessary, but I don't believe them too much. I think we should also don't let down the argument that opening up data is not a means by itself, but is part of a bigger program which is transforming government to become more open and more ready for the digital age. And I think if we hold this argument strong, then maybe the economic argument we can answer that later on.
If I can just inject one thought that crossed my mind yesterday when we had a dinner conversation. I mean, open data, we see it also as a kind of an infrastructure program. And it's probably telling about the times we live in that we have really to demonstrate the impacts quite clearly when we make policy choices. But was that the case when we started building up a network of public phone booths 70, 80 years ago? So putting a phone booth somewhere in a town or in the countryside, would people wonder what is the impact on society by putting out phone booths? And did they measure like the added value we had when people actually could phone each other if they had not yet a private phone at home? Did we measure that? We didn't. So it's quite telling, I think, today that we have to undergo all these exercises, which were just for granted at some time ago.
Yes, something I would like to add to that. Yes, I'm very much interested in impact, but I'm also always slightly suspicious when public sector bodies ask about impact, because it's the public sector that quite often isn't really interested in establishing impact of any of their policies, because it's politically much more interesting to promise something cool and then hope people will forget it until the next election, than actually assess whether what you've done and what you've promised has been realized or not. So impact assessment is a very sort of low priority field, it seems, in the public sector bodies that I deal with. And asking for impact of open data, sometimes that, because of that, feels as an excuse to not act now.
Can I just add one thing? Unfortunately, I agree with you, Ton, that sometimes we're not quite as interested in measuring effect or impact as we are in just presenting new policies and new initiatives. I think another thing we need to remember is that we need to change our metrics. I mean, some of my closest colleagues work on the Danish Citizens Portal, and at the moment they are struggling a little bit now that we're trying to implement the new PSI directive, because they realize that once they put digital content on the portal, it will be open to reuse by default. And you would think that that would be a good thing, because that is a kind of a free lunch. They were going to publish this information anyway, and now they have actually made it available for reuse, and that's like, it's really good, isn't it? No, it's not, because at the moment their success is being measured in how many unique users can they actually demonstrate that the portal has every week. And if people are no longer using this content, this information on the portal, but they're simply downloading it and then they're presenting it to people in other channels, they are afraid that they're going to lose quite a large number of users. And so does that mean that their portal is no longer a success? Yes. So we need to think about those metrics. It's completely crazy that we're still measuring how many people are actually visiting the portal. I mean, the point should be how many people are actually using the content that we produce, how many people are using the services. We don't care if they use the service or the content on our portal or on somebody else's, as long as they use it, as long as they do what we want them to do in the end. But even though I sit with literally not even a closed door between my office and their office, and they used to work with me on the open data agenda, they are still struggling with this problem, and it's a real life problem for them. And I think that just shows that sometimes we have some like first world problems that can really be serious obstacles to our second or third or, I don't know, 10th world ideas of how we want to open up data.
Would anyone like to fill in with a question or a comment? From behind.
Yeah, hi, thanks everyone. It was really great to hear you all. Then I liked the idea of the traffic congestion, and there seemed to be like some funding with that for startups to be able to try to create some solutions. Is there any other, and also with, I think it was you, Tom, that was also talking about the sort of fellowship grants for individuals who are using open data as well, or maybe that was Germany. But is it common to have like a startup funding initiative for in your countries or in cities in each of those countries that is then being able to provide some money for startups or even established businesses to be able to make use of open data to create new products and services?
I don't think it's common in the Netherlands. Partly because the people that you would like to be involved with these type of projects are usually not the ones who actually already have connections to the public sector bodies or the funding bodies that that they should have. And so a lot of the initiatives that seem to aim that way, that as you described, actually just end up connecting to incumbent parties and existing stakeholders and not the new ones. So there's not a whole lot of that going on. I think the sort of worst case example would be the top sector innovation policy by the Ministry for Economic Affairs in the Netherlands, and they ended up sort of supporting financially the companies and the sectors that are already hugely successful. So nothing new is going to come out of that. It was just sort of free money for existing people. So it's not common. And the fellowships, that was probably somebody else, right? Yeah, Daniel?
Yeah, on the fellowship programs, I can say no, they don't exist in Germany, and this is why we want to make them happen. They exist largely in the US. I don't know if some of you have maybe heard of Code for America, which is a very successful program in that area. We aim to bring it to Germany, and I think, yeah, we hopefully we'll make it happen next year. And the idea really is to convince investors that investing money in startups that work with open data is a good idea.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hello, my name is Christopher Sjöholm. I'm a data journalist at Swedish Television. None of you mentioned data journalism as one of the way to get impact. I would like to have your opinion on that.
I mentioned data journalists.
Okay, I wasn't listening.
You're right, I didn't mention data journalism. I could easily have done so. It's a great way of getting impact. You look at the way the journalism is progressing as a profession. Data-driven stories are coming out. The work that The Guardian does is amazing on the data blog. The same with the FT. We run a course in data journalism, but you probably already knew that. But.
Yeah. I agree. Data journalism is interesting and exciting. I just didn't mention it. Actually, the first visualization was from a data journalism project. What I do notice in the Netherlands, when you look at data journalism, is that quite a lot of the efforts are focused on using the data to disclose something about the functioning of government, which is a very important function. But it also has the effect that data holders might think, if I publish something, I will see it on the front page tomorrow, which is usually not an incentive to. What I think is still missing in data journalism in the Netherlands is using the public data to find other type of stories, which I think would be very exciting to do, but there's little of that already going on in the Netherlands, and I would hope that will develop over time.
I'll just add that it's my impression that the situation in Denmark is pretty much like in the Netherlands, that government tends to see data journalism as criticism. And I think it's basically because probably we haven't realized that we can actually work with data journalists, and they can help us identify problems, but not just problems, also opportunities. I just think we haven't really got to the point where we realize that there's more to it than just scandals, basically.
Yes, hi, my name is Björn. I work at the Swedish Public Employment Service. Thank you very much for very interesting talks. I was wondering, and I think this question kind of correlates to what you said, Catherine, about focusing the return on investment on the metrics based on the platforms that you could use for people working with the APIs or open data. Now, building those platforms, I think, is a really good thing, of course. Several of you have been talking about pan-European platforms or national-based platforms. Now, have you been studying what's been going on other platforms, on how to interact with people already formed by doing this work? I'm sure the discussion's been going on for quite a while, and how do you want to pull these users into the platform once it's up there?
Actually in Denmark we have like the national data catalog, which is definitely not quite as good as I would like it to be, and I think that is part of the reason why it's not really being used all that much. Another thing is that we don't really know how much it's being used because our metrics are just not sophisticated enough to show us if people are actually using the data. 2 cities in Denmark, Copenhagen and Aarhus. Aarhus is the second largest city in Denmark. They have actually built their own platforms. And I think they are going to have an easier job of creating some kind of community surrounding those platforms because they have the city setting that people feel are more connected to their city, and they want to solve city-related problems, and so they're going to probably be more inclined to participate in some kind of community surrounding those platforms. And I really hope that, first of all, I hope that these platforms will become very, very successful, and I hope that we can learn from some of their tricks of how to build a community, even though what we're running is actually a national platform. And I would also very much like to see that national platforms in different countries will actually start to work together. And that's why I emphasize my appeal. Shouldn't we be doing something in the Nordic region? I mean, after all, we understand each other. We're pretty similar. I think we should do that. And that includes exchanging experience on how to engage people and, for example, how to measure use. Because at the moment we have a problem that even if our data catalog was successful, which I don't believe it to be, but even if it was, I wouldn't know about it. And so I need some inspiration and some easy tools to actually measure this, because we don't really want to create some kind of registration scheme in which you have to tell us a lot about yourself before we'll let you have the data. On the other hand, we would very much like to invite you to tell us what you're using the data for, simply so that we can become much better at providing data, and we can actually start collecting those usage stories that will help us convince more public sector bodies to open up their data.
Anyone else? No? So 2014, focusing on opening the data and also including the private sector. Are there any risks, Daniel?
I think I wouldn't focus on opening the data. I would focus on helping others to reuse the data that's already there. Risks? No.
Also, I would say, I mean, we're far at the beginning. Well, to really have risks at this stage of the development, I mean, the public officials are very prudent, and all the administrations really seem that they're very prudent because they see all these risks. So the risk avoidance happens at the outset of what happens, and we have a hell of a trouble also inside the Commission to sell the idea that someone will use the data for a completely unforeseen purpose, which is behind the very idea, and not every official feels entirely comfortable with that. The private data, I think some of the elements that were mentioned are very important. Utilities starting up to open the data. There are at least two examples I know from Italy and from Berlin. The Vattenfall company is a utility in Berlin on electricity data, and that is, I think, one of the fields that has, I think, a big potential because of smart metering, smart grid, renewable energies kind of discussion. And some of, so to say, private or let's say at least business-related data is going to be opening up. Surprised that no question yet came on the EU privacy regulation that is in the making. I'm happy about it because I'm twice removed from the discussion myself, because there's a different service in the Commission that deals with it, and also inside my own service I'm not the person dealing with it, but obviously we observe the privacy regulation. And one element I found interesting is that that has made its way into the text is the use of pseudonymous data, so not anonymous data, because that would mean the data at the source are already anonymous, but the idea that at the source you separate the identifier from data elements that are then anonymous, allowing you still to recombine if you are a commercial provider to actually need to target me as an individual with advertisement, but that you can sell the, so to say, anonymous bit as a separate element. That's my understanding on what I'm reading about the evolution. It's hard to tell because the process is in the making, but we hope that this will bring more legal safety to companies and reusers in the future.
Right. I think one of the greatest risks is to focus too much on risk. Luckily, it seems to me that we're moving away from that in Denmark. Not really fast, but it seems that things are moving in the right direction. I think another risk is that we either get overly excited or we just become completely disillusioned. Either way, that we lose our focus on staying agile. and keeping our senses open and keeping an open mind as to how to do this. Because I think the moment we come complacent and lazy and we decide that now we have found that one-size-fits-all solution, then we're actually doing the wrong thing, and we should be backtracking and we should start over from scratch.
Yeah, so for me, 2014 is like a synthesis of everything you've heard so far. It's going to be about opening up the data, yes, but being focused around problems and making sure that we use the data to solve some problems for people in society, because then that will drive use, and it will create the virtuous circle where people will be able to point to that and go, that's why we should be opening up our data. So you'll see the impact of the open. And yeah, that's...
Yeah, and also I think by doing that, focusing on the issue, you actually create a context where you have stakeholders that are already part of that, working together around that data, and actually that helps mitigate any potential risk, because the risks are only sort of really risky if there's no established context in which you think they will play out. If you have an established context as in a specific issue, you already know the field that you're working in, and you know how likely a certain risk will be, yes or no. In general, I have this slide that lists 51 perceived risks up front. What's his name, Rolf Nordquist of Bisnode, he was talking about openness on a conference in Slovenia a couple of weeks ago, and he said that when he asked in Sweden for data, he got answers that were 50 shades of no. And I have a slide that actually lists 51 of those, so there's not 50, it's 51 shades of no. And they're all about perceived risks. The thing is, none of those risks actually play out in reality, otherwise we would have seen it. Across the world, already for years, sometimes more than a decade, lots and lots of data has been published publicly for everybody to reuse. And a lot of the risks that I hear up front never materialized over that period. Yes, we are making mistakes because we are opening up a new field. But making mistakes is the only way to learn how to do this properly. So we need to learn how to experiment in an agile way so that we can sort of also make mistakes cheaply. And then the risks are okay, because then they're part of the game, basically.
Okay, thank you. Time is out. Thank you all for coming to listen. Thank you to the organisers. Well done, VINNOVA, for fixing this very interesting seminar. And thank you especially to all our panelists for making this an extremely interesting session. Thank you. Lunch.